Today what we're going to be doing is looking at part of Chapter 1 notes. So as you look at the beginning of it, you'll need to skip down a little bit to where it says the scientific method. So the scientific method is a logical approach to the solutions of problems. You probably heard about the scientific method for the first time when you were in elementary school, and really, not a lot has changed. The first thing you start out with the scientific method is you make some kind of observation. You acknowledge some kind of problem that you have seen. Next, you come up with that question or that problem. Next, we do research as what has already been done about that problem. Research what other scientists have done, maybe research online to see if there's some kind of problem guide. Next, we form a hypothesis, then experiment. From the experiment, we gather data and observations, maybe in the form of numbers in a data table or a graph. And then finally, we form our conclusion and report that to others. Now we're going to look at each of these things individually. My observation was, when my daughter was little, is that she had a little plastic flashlight and she brought it to me and it didn't work. So from that observation I came up with the question, why does the flashlight not work? Another thing I could ask is, what is wrong with the flashlight? I could be even more specific. Are the batteries dead in the flashlight? All of these things are good questions to ask. In looking at the flashlight, you might want to do some research. I might find the papers that came with it and figure out what kind of battery it takes. What type of light bulb does it use? Maybe has anyone ever seen the flashlight work? Perhaps it's been broken the entire time. From then, I come up with my hypothesis. And I know you've been told for years and years and years that a hypothesis is an educated what? Yes, guess. I like it better as an educated explanation. An educated explanation sounds like you know what the problem is, or at least you have a pretty good idea what the problem is. A guess just sounds like a guess. So I have some examples of some bad hypotheses here and some good hypotheses. And so here are some bad hypotheses. Batteries. Okay, that doesn't explain anything. I think it is broke. We know it is broke. We're trying to find out why it is broke. And then the next one I wrote up there is flashlights need batteries to work. Although it is a true statement that flashlights need batteries to work, it really doesn't explain why the flashlight is not working. So here's some examples of some good hypotheses. And really you're just stating the answer to the actual question that you've asked earlier. So the batteries in the flashlight are dead, the light bulb is burnt out, the switch is broken, something like that. So the next part we have is the actual experiment that we're going to be doing. You are going to be writing up an experiment in the next couple of days, and these are some things to keep in mind. First, you need to have some numerical steps. A gigantic paragraph describing your experiment doesn't really help out somebody who's trying to duplicate it. You must communicate the exact steps that are taken. No approximations, measurements in milliliters, grams, time in seconds, minutes, something that somebody can follow, because the experiment must be repeatable to be tested. From that experiment, we do collect data. We do have to make sure that our measurements must be precise and accurate. And we're going to get into more details about what those terms mean, but precision has to do with being able to get the same results every single time. And accurate has to do with it being correct. Also on your data, all measurements must have units. You have to label every single one or create a data table that has the label in the top. And then lastly, it says all graphs and tables must be labeled. That means on your graphs, you have to give your graph a title, you have to label your axes, and give the unit of measure on each of the axes. In addition to data, you are also going to write observations. In fact, the lab that we're going to be doing very shortly, we are going to be recording as many observations as we can. Make sure that your observation is really an observation and not an inference. An observation is something that you detect with your five senses, or that you use some kind of instrument to measure, for instance, like a thermometer or a ruler. Make sure that you're not making inferences. Inferences are interpretations about what you are seeing. And so we have a picture here, and I'd like you to make some observations about it. Okay, well, we can see perhaps that there is a woman. I'm assuming it's a woman. We can know that it's a person for sure. What else do we know? We know she's holding a cup to her face. Is it a glass? Don't know. It could be plastic. So I know it's colorless. I know it's transparent. Container of some sort. What's in it? Is it water? Is it Sprite? Who knows? It appears to be a liquid inside of there, a colorless liquid. Is she really drinking it, or is she just holding it up to her face? It's hard to tell. So what we can see in this picture is that there is a human with what appears to be a liquid in a glass holding the liquid to her face. And that's about it. From our data and observations, we form a conclusion. A conclusion answers our question that we were asking. Again, I've given you some examples of bad conclusions and good conclusions. Some of the bad conclusions that I see frequently was, I was right, or I was wrong. We don't know what you're talking about, so you have to specify. Kind of an offshoot of that is, my hypothesis was right, or wrong. Again, I don't know what you're talking about. The last one is one of my favorites that I get. It was dead in it. I have no idea what those its are, so you need to make sure that you use the appropriate nouns for whatever sentence you're trying to convey. Here's some good conclusions. The batteries were dead in the flashlight. My hypothesis was correct. Changing the batteries did not make the flashlight work. Therefore, my hypothesis was incorrect. My new hypothesis is that the bulb in the flashlight is burnt out. So again, you need to kind of state the answer to the question. You can say whether your hypothesis was correct or not, and if you want to suggest a different hypothesis, then you can. The next little part of notes has to do with the words theory and law, and I'm sure you've heard of these things before. A theory is a well-tested and generally accepted explanation of scientific phenomenon. And so the words we're looking for there is accepted explanation of scientific phenomenon. The key thing to a theory being a theory is that it is just generally an explanation for it, and the general scientific community agrees on that explanation. However, it's something that really can't be tested, so therefore no one ever says that it is a truth. And so when you hear theories, no reason to get upset, they're just theories. And I know a lot of people get upset about the theory of evolution, Big Bang Theory. Again, no reason to get upset. No one ever said it's the truth. It's just currently what the scientific community believes. Next we have law. What a law is a statement that summarizes observations and experimentation. I love laws. They don't attempt to explain anything, and usually they're mathematical in nature. Some of the laws you might be familiar with may be Newton's laws of motion. For every action force, there's an equal and opposite reaction force. Or maybe some of the laws of thermodynamics. Energy is neither created nor destroyed. None of those statements explain anything. They're just saying that something that they have observed. The last thing that we're going to talk about are experimental variables. And there are 3 experimental variables that we are going to talk about and a control that we are going to talk about. And so the first variable that we have is our independent variable. The independent variable is independent of anything in the experiment, and it's what you, as the scientist or the experimenter, actually controls. Then we have the dependent variable. The dependent variable is the one that responds to the independent variable. For instance, I change the amount of food that I eat. That would be an independent variable. And then I see how heavy I get. That would be a dependent variable. The next one we have is a constant variable. And what a constant variable is a variable that we could change in an experiment, but we choose to hold constant. And that's very important when you're running an experiment, that you have very, very few independent variables. Usually we only try to have one thing that we're changing, and we try to keep everything else the same. For instance, if we were growing plants and trying to find out if singing to them makes them grow taller, well, then we would have to keep the amount of water, the amount of sunlight, the amount of fertilizer that we give them. We would have to keep all those things the same to make sure that they're not having an effect on how our plant grows. And then lastly, we have a control. And what a control is an experiment that is run that is your standard of comparison. So it's a comparison experiment. Again, on the plant experiment, if I wanted to find out if singing makes my plants grow taller, well, then I would have to have a set of plants that are grown in the exact same conditions that I don't sing to, that are kept away from everything else. In an experiment where they are testing different kinds of medication to see if they work. Again, you have a group that takes the medication, but to see if it truly works, you would have to have a group that also has the same illness that doesn't take the medication. And that would be an example of your control group. So whatever the standard would be. All right, so the very last thing we're going to do is we're going to look at example 1 on our notes here. And it says that I'm conducting an experiment to find out if teenage girls own more pairs of shoes than teenage boys do. And so my question is who owns more pairs of shoes, teenage boys or teenage girls? And so my hypothesis can go 3 different ways. One, we could say that girls, or hypothesize that girls own more shoes than boys. We could say the opposite is true, that teenage boys own more shoes than girls. And then lastly, if we don't really have any data to support it, we could say that both teenage boys and girls own about the same number of shoes. And so from your research, you could make your educated guess, which I would think teenage girls would own more shoes than boys, but it might be a surprise. So from that, what we're going to do is we're going to try to figure out the variables. So looking at this, what is the thing that you have control of? Let's say you're running this experiment. What do you have control of? Well, what you have control of is you have control of who you're going to ask about the number of shoes. So you have control of the gender of the subject, whether you're asking girls or boys. What's responding to this? Well, what's responding to this is the number of shoes. You don't have any control over that. All you can do is ask a girl or a boy or how many shoes that they have, and they will tell you, and then that will be the responding or dependent variable. What are you keeping constant? Well, you're keeping constant that you're only asking teenagers. You're not asking children or adults or the elderly how many pairs of shoes they have. What else are you keeping constant? Well, you're keeping constant that you're asking them just about shoes. You're not asking about the number of t-shirts they own, the number of hats that they own, the number of pairs of pants that they own, just about shoes. So those are just a couple of them, and there may be more. Maybe you can come up with more and tell me about them in class tomorrow. Let's look at the next slide. And so we can see here my independent variable was who I asked, the boys or girls. My dependent variable was the number of pair of shoes. I only have one constant listed here, the teenagers, but you could put that you're asking about shoes as another constant. And then lastly, as a control for this experiment, what we could do is compare the number of shoes that teenagers own to the average number of shoes of all type of people have. What I'd like you to do for homework is to go ahead and try to do examples number 2 and 3 and get ready to talk about them tomorrow morning. I'll see you then.